Imagine yourself in a time of darkness and uncertainty, an ancient era long before kings or organized armies ruled the land. We are in the period of the Judges, a chaotic time in Israel when God's people lived without a fixed leader, governed by men and women directly chosen by him in critical moments. The people often fell into the temptation of following other gods, distancing themselves from the Lord, and thus facing harsh consequences. It was a land marked by constant invasions and oppression, and the greatest enemies at that time were the Philistines, a powerful and cruel civilization that controlled and subjugated the Israelites, humiliating them at every opportunity. Fear and despair dominated the hearts of the tribes of Israel, who no longer knew where to turn or how to break the chains of oppression. And it was in this dark setting that a promise emerged, a ray of hope sent directly from the heavens. An angel appeared to Manoah's wife, a barren woman, and made an extraordinary announcement. She, who had never given birth, would conceive a special son, a son consecrated to God from the womb. He would be a Nazirite, set apart by the Lord for a grand mission. This son, who would be named Samson, was never to cut his hair or drink wine, for his entire life would be dedicated to a higher purpose, to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. He would be a judge, a warrior, and above all, God's chosen one to save his people. Thus, even before he was born, Samson's life was already marked by a divine mission, a life of greatness, power, and challenges that would forever transform the history of Israel. This would be the beginning of an epic journey where strength and weakness, pride and faith would intertwine in a tragic and heroic manner. Samson's destiny was set, and so, with the promise of his birth, new hope blossomed in the hearts of the people of Israel. The stage was being set for a story that would echo through generations. Time passed, and just as the angel had said, Manoah's wife conceived and gave birth to a strong and healthy boy. They named him Samson as instructed, and from the start, there was something different about the boy. The glow of a divine promise hovered over him. From a young age, Samson was taught about his special calling. His parents raised him according to the Nazirite vow. He never tasted wine or fermented drinks, nor did he ever feel the blade of a knife on his hair. Everyone knew that Samson's strength and destiny did not come merely from his upbringing but from his direct connection with the Lord. As Samson grew, something unusual also began to manifest in him. His physical strength was extraordinary, even supernatural. Even as a young man, he could perform feats that left his family and neighbors perplexed. He could lift large rocks, fell trees with his bare hands, and accomplish feats that no ordinary man would dare attempt. But his strength wasn't just physical. There was also a strength of spirit that drove him to seek justice, to test his limits. He felt, from an early age, that he was destined for something greater than his peaceful life in the mountains of Zorah. Then, one seemingly ordinary day, Samson decided to venture beyond his village, towards the lands dominated by the Philistines. It was there, in that hostile environment, that he encountered a challenge that would forever change his view of himself. While walking through a vineyard, a young and fierce lion, roaring with hunger, emerged from the shadows and attacked Samson by surprise. But instead of being overcome by fear, something powerful awakened within him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him with might, and Samson, with his bare hands, tore the lion apart as if it were nothing more than a simple goat. This was the first time he experienced the true power that God had given him. The lion lying at his feet was not just a symbol of his strength but also a reminder that he was not like other men. He was destined to be a weapon in God's hands, an indomitable force that, in due time, would be used to free Israel from the Philistines. Samson knew this was just the beginning of his journey. The mountains and valleys where he grew up were no longer enough to contain his spirit. Destiny was calling him, and he was beginning to understand that his life would be marked by battles, victories, challenges, and a mission much greater than himself. After defeating the lion, Samson continued on his way, carrying with him the memory of that confrontation as a marker of his strength. Time passed, and he continued to grow, both in vigor and in confidence. But his life would take an unexpected turn when he became involved with a Philistine woman from Timnah. Something within Samson, a curiosity or perhaps a desire for challenge, led him to her. He returned home and told his parents about the woman, saying that he wanted to marry her. His request left his family perplexed. They questioned, "Why a woman from the Philistines, our oppressors? Are there no women among our people?" But Samson was determined. He saw something beyond cultural barriers and blood conflicts. "She pleases me," he said. And though his parents did not know, Samson's desire was part of a larger plan. God was moving unseen pieces on the board of destiny, using even Samson's desires for a greater purpose. So Samson set out with his parents for Timnah to arrange the marriage. Along the way, he passed by the vineyard where he had fought the lion. Curious, he veered off the path and went to the place where he had left it. The lion's carcass was still there, but something unusual had happened. A swarm of bees had taken up residence in the carcass, and there was honey. Without hesitation, Samson reached out, took a honeycomb, and ate. He even brought some to his parents without mentioning the origin of the sweet treat. That bizarre scene, the sweetness emerging from death, would be a harbinger of the lessons to come in his life, a mix of brutal strength and unexpected sweetness, of victories and losses. At the wedding feast, Samson, always cunning and bold, posed a riddle to the 30 Philistine men present. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. He wagered 30 fine garments, believing they could never solve the riddle. The Philistines, frustrated and desperate, resorted to vile methods to win the bet. They pressured Samson's wife, threatening her until she gave in and extracted the answer from her husband. When the Philistines returned and solved the riddle, Samson immediately understood what had happened. His wife had betrayed him, revealing his secret. Furious and humiliated, he left, seeking revenge. He went down to Ashkelon, a Philistine city, and killed 30 men, stripping them of their garments to pay his debt. The marriage, which began with promises and celebrations, ended in betrayal and violence. This would be only the first of many clashes between Samson and the Philistines, but what he did not yet know was that his battles would always be accompanied by a personal echo of tragedy. Deep down, Samson was a man divided, between his strength and his vulnerability, between his divine calling and his human desires. The stage for an even greater confrontation was being set. After the tumultuous end of his marriage, Samson's fury continued to boil in his heart. He returned to his father's house, leaving behind his wife and everything that had happened in Timnah. But the feeling of vengeance did not subside so easily. Months later, still inflamed by resentment, he decided to return to Timnah, seeking reconciliation with his wife. However, upon arriving there, Samson discovered something that ignited his anger even more. His father-in-law had given his wife to another man, one of his companions at the feast. Samson's wounded pride and thirst for retribution led him to conceive an even more creative and devastating revenge. He captured 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail in pairs, and attached torches between them. After lighting the torches, he released the foxes into the Philistines' fields and vineyards. The foxes, maddened by the fire, ran in all directions, setting everything ablaze. The fields, vineyards, and even olive groves of the Philistines were consumed by flames. The destruction was immense, and the loss of their crops struck at the heart of the Philistine economy. It was a swift response to the betrayal he had suffered, a warning that Samson could not be underestimated or humiliated with impunity. The Philistines, in turn, were furious. Determined to punish whoever was responsible for such destruction, they discovered what had motivated Samson to act. In retaliation, they cruelly burned his ex-wife and her father alive. The brutality of their actions only served to further fuel the cycle of hatred and violence between Samson and the Philistines. When Samson learned of the tragedy, his already deep anger turned into an implacable desire for vengeance. He swore he would not rest until he had exacted justice himself. And so, he attacked the Philistines again, killing many of them with devastating force, without mercy. Samson then withdrew to a cave in the rock of Etam, isolated and immersed in his thoughts of vengeance and his unfinished mission. But the Philistines, determined to capture him, did not give up. They marched into Judah, demanding that the men of Israel hand over Samson. The pressure was so great that 3,000 men of Judah went up to the cave where Samson was hiding. They feared the Philistines so much that they begged Samson to surrender to avoid further bloodshed. Samson, always strategic, agreed, but on one condition, that they themselves would not kill him, but only hand him over alive to the Philistines. Bound with new ropes, Samson was brought to Lehi, where the Philistines awaited him with shouts of triumph, certain of their victory. But little did they know that the Spirit of the Lord would once again descend upon Samson with power. The ropes binding him dissolved like burnt flax threads. Looking around, Samson found the jawbone of a donkey on the ground. With this unlikely weapon, he attacked the Philistines, striking down 1,000 of them in a fierce battle. His enemies fell like grass before his overwhelming strength. After the fight, Samson, exhausted and thirsty, cried out to the Lord for water. And God, hearing his servant's cry, opened a crack in the rock, from which a spring of water flowed. Thus, Samson, revived, remembered that his strength came from God and not from himself. But even knowing this, the path ahead would be marked by more battles, temptations, and eventually, his greatest downfall. After defeating 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey and having his thirst miraculously quenched, Samson returned to his life as a judge in Israel. He continued to be feared by his enemies and respected by his own people, but the battle between him and the Philistines was far from over. The destruction of the crops and the deaths he had caused left deep scars, and the Philistines still sought revenge. While Samson fulfilled his role as judge and defender of Israel, he also became increasingly entangled in personal conflicts, driven not only by his divine duty but also by his human desires. And it was in one of these moments, during one of his journeys to the Philistine city of Gaza, that his life would take another dangerous turn. In Gaza, Samson became involved with a prostitute. News of his presence spread quickly, and the Philistine leaders, seeing a golden opportunity, set a trap. They planned to capture him while he was still in the city, blocking the gates at night to prevent his escape. But in the middle of the night, before they could execute their plan, Samson got up, aware that something was wrong. And in a feat that once again demonstrated his superhuman strength, he went to the city gates, massive and reinforced, tore them out of the ground along with the bars and posts, and carried them to the top of a distant hill. The scene made it clear once again that capturing Samson would not be an easy task. However, his physical strength could not protect his heart from the dangers that lurked. Samson, now more confident and perhaps even complacent with his victories, found a new woman who stirred his spirit, Delilah, a woman from the valley of Sorek. His involvement with Delilah would be the catalyst for a series of events that would lead to his greatest challenge. Unlike his previous relationships, the connection between Samson and Delilah was deep and intense. But Delilah, unlike Samson, had her own interests. Soon the Philistine leaders saw in her an opportunity to finally capture the man who had humiliated them so much. They approached her with a tempting offer, a large sum of money in exchange for discovering the secret of Samson's strength. Delilah accepted the offer and then began her journey of seduction and manipulation. She asked Samson, with sweetness and persistence, what made him so strong. At first, Samson played with her questions, offering false answers. He said that if he were tied with new ropes, or with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would lose his strength. Delilah, true to her plan, tested each of these answers, but each time she tried, Samson deceived her and easily broke his bonds. However, Delilah did not give up. She persisted, day after day, pressuring him, complaining that he did not trust her, until finally, exhausted by her pleas and enchanted by her, Samson gave in. He revealed the secret of his strength. His hair, which had never been cut since birth, was the symbol of his consecration to God. If it were cut, he would lose his power. Delilah, realizing that she now had the truth, waited for the right moment. While Samson slept, she called the Philistines, who brought a man to cut the 7 braids of his hair. When the strands fell to the ground, Samson woke up, but his strength had left him with his hair. He stood up, believing he could free himself from his enemies as before, but realized, too late, that his strength had been taken. The Philistines easily captured him, cruelly blinding him and dragging him away as a prisoner. The great Samson, the man who had tormented the Philistines and liberated Israel, was led away in chains and humiliated. They put him to work grinding grain in a prison, as if he were nothing more than a beast of burden. Samson, now blind and powerless, was left alone in his darkness, where the weight of his choices and his vulnerability caught up with him. However, even in the midst of his fall, something began to change. His hair slowly began to grow back again. Reduced to the condition of a slave, blind and humiliated, Samson was forced to work grinding grain in a Philistine prison. The man who had once terrified his enemies was now treated as a spectacle of scorn. Yet, as he turned the grinding wheel, alone in his darkness, his thoughts turned to God. The strength he had once relied on as his own, he now realized had always come from the Lord, and over time, his spirit began to humble itself before him. Samson spent his days in the harsh and monotonous routine of the prison, but with each passing day, his hair grew again. And with it, a new spark of hope began to burn in his heart. He was no longer the arrogant and confident man who believed he was in control of his destiny. Now, Samson was a broken man, but his deep repentance reconnected him once again with the God who had chosen him before he was even born. Meanwhile, the Philistines celebrated his capture. They felt victorious, certain that they had finally defeated their nation's greatest enemy. In their arrogance, they organized a great feast in honor of Dagon, their god, to give thanks for their victory over Samson. The event attracted thousands of Philistines to the temple, all eager to see the man who had caused so much destruction. The Philistine leaders sent for Samson from the prison, wanting to display him as a trophy before the crowd. He was brought to the temple, guided by a young boy, as his blindness had left him entirely dependent. The crowd laughed and jeered as he was paraded as a symbol of Israel's defeat. The laughter echoed off the temple's columns as the Philistines toasted their victory. But in the midst of that humiliation, Samson asked the boy to lead him to the main pillars that supported the temple. He wished to lean on them to rest. The boy, suspecting nothing, complied. When Samson felt the pillars beneath his hands, he lifted his voice in a fervent prayer. His plea was different this time. It was not the arrogance of a man seeking personal victory but the humble supplication of someone who recognized his total dependence on God. He prayed, "O sovereign Lord, remember me. O God, strengthen me just once more, so that I may take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson concentrated all his strength, and with one final cry, he pushed the pillars with all his might. The temple trembled. The pillars gave way, and the roof collapsed on the crowd. Chaos ensued, and screams of panic filled the air as the massive structure crumbled. Thousands of Philistines, including their leaders, were killed in the collapse. Samson's sacrifice was complete. He died alongside his enemies, but in his death, he accomplished what he could never do in life: he delivered Israel from Philistine rule. Samson, the strong man who had been vulnerable to the weaknesses of the heart, found redemption in his final act. And so, he fulfilled his destiny. His brothers came to retrieve his body from the rubble, and he was buried in the tomb of his father, Manoah. Samson's story would echo through generations as a reminder that, while strength may fail, true power comes from faith in God. The cycle of his life showed that even in the depths of failure, there is still the possibility of redemption. After Samson's death, the Philistine temple remained in ruins. The echo of destruction and the silence that followed stood as a testament to the relentless strength of that man, who in his death took with him thousands of enemies. The Israelites, in turn, were deeply marked by Samson's sacrifice. He had become a symbol not only of strength but also of redemption and of God's power, even through human weakness. Samson's brothers, who had rescued his body from the rubble, buried him with honor in his father's tomb. There, under the earth of his ancestors, he finally rested, but his story would not be forgotten. For years, Samson's name would be recited around the campfires of Israel, a living reminder of what happens when someone is chosen by God for a mission, even when that person fails so many times along the way. However, what many may not have realized was the true legacy Samson left behind. It wasn't just his final act of physical strength that would define his story, but the spiritual journey he undertook, full of falls and redemption. Samson, who had begun his life with a divine promise, had also lived a life full of contradictions. A man destined to be Israel's judge and deliverer, but also a man ruled by his passions and human weaknesses. Yet God used even his failures to fulfill the greater purpose. Samson's death marked the beginning of a new phase of deliverance for the people of Israel. The Philistines, devastated by the loss of their leaders and warriors, were significantly weakened, and the oppressive control they had over Israel began to diminish. The people of Israel, now reflecting on Samson's life, began to understand that true strength was not only in muscles or physical accomplishments. Strength came from obedience to God, from humility and dependence on Him. Samson was an example of both greatness and vulnerability, and his story served as both a warning and an inspiration for those who came after. And so, as the years passed and new judges rose, Samson's memory remained as one of the most powerful and paradoxical. A man who began with a glorious destiny and, through his struggles, found his final redemption in the sacrifice of his own life. The Israelites, strengthened by the memory of this judge who had given himself for them, moved forward, with their eyes turned to the future, aware that the God of Samson was still with them, ready to raise other heroes, other judges, in their time of need. As time passed, Samson's story continued to resonate among the tribes of Israel. His feats and final sacrifice were recited with pride, but also with a mix of reverence and warning. The elders and leaders knew that as powerful as Samson was, his life carried important lessons, not only about physical strength but about the fragility of human nature and the importance of faithfulness to God. The Philistines, shaken by the destruction of their temple and the loss of so many of their leaders, withdrew for a time, giving Israel a period of relative peace. The shadow of Philistine oppression dissipated, and the Israelites could breathe easier, even if only temporarily. However, they knew that enemies from outside always lurked, ready to strike when least expected. Life in Israel returned to normal. The tribes worked their fields, tended their flocks, and built their families, but Samson's story was always present, a reminder of how God could act through a man, even in his weaknesses. Parents told their children how Samson had been chosen before birth, how his strength came from the Lord, but also how he had strayed from the path by giving in to his passions. And, more importantly, they emphasized how, even in the midst of failure, Samson found final redemption by fully surrendering to God's will. Still, not everyone fully understood the lessons of this story. Some Israelites, fascinated by Samson's strength, focused only on his heroic feats. For them, Samson was a symbol of physical victory over enemies, without understanding the spiritual depth of his life and sacrifice. With time, the leaders began to realize that the people needed more than stories of brute strength. They needed leaders who would guide them spiritually, reminding Israel of its covenant with God. Samson, in all his physical grandeur, had not managed to bring lasting peace because his mission was centered on physical war against the Philistines, while the people needed a return to the heart of faith. And so, new judges arose in Israel. Men and women who understood the need to restore the people's faith in God, not just their military strength. They inspired the people to trust less in their own strength and more in their obedience to God's will, reinforcing that the most enduring victories came from spiritual faithfulness. As the years passed, Samson's story became intertwined with the other stories of the era of the judges, but it always held a special place. He was a figure of impressive power and, at the same time, a warning that, without obedience and humility before God, even the strongest of men could fall. Even in his death, Samson brought deliverance, but he also left a mark that Israel would never forget. Physical strength, no matter how great, was fleeting. What endured was the relationship with God, the only true strength that could sustain and guide the people. As the years passed and generations succeeded, Samson's story continued to be told, but now with a deeper understanding of its implications. Israel's spiritual leaders and elders began to use his life as a powerful metaphor, a warning against pride and self-sufficiency, but also as a testimony of God's mercy and redemption, even in the darkest moments. Samson, in all his physical grandeur, failed to realize, until his final days, that his true strength came from his consecration to God and not from his own powers. Israel, in remembering Samson, also reflected on its own relationship with the Lord. The cycle of disobedience and suffering that repeated among the people was not very different from Samson's trajectory. Just as he strayed from God in pursuit of his own desires, Israel often turned to other gods, distancing themselves from their true source of strength and protection. The rabbis and elders began teaching that Samson was more than just a judge, he was a mirror of the nation itself. His fall, blindness, and eventual redemption were a symbolic representation of what happened to Israel whenever the people strayed from the ways of God. They were delivered into oppression and spiritual blindness. But just as Samson's hair began to grow again, Israel's hope could always be renewed if they turned their hearts back to God. Despite all of Samson's failures, his story ended with a redemption that few expected. In his final moments, he turned to God with all the faith he had left. His final plea, humble and desperate, was answered. It was not an act of pride or personal vengeance, but an act of sacrifice. Samson, by destroying the temple and the Philistines, gave his own life to deliver Israel. His death, in a way, restored the divine purpose for which he had been destined from the beginning. This reflection on Samson's final redemption began to echo in Israel. The people now understood that the true hero was not the one who only won physical battles, but the one who, even after falling, found redemption in God. Samson was not perfect, far from it, but his story showed that even in the deepest darkness and failure, God's mercy could bring redemption. Thus, Samson's legacy became something greater than his acts of physical strength. He became a symbol of spiritual renewal, a reminder that the covenant with God, even if broken, could be restored with repentance and humility. The Israelites carried this lesson with them, aware that, like Samson, they too had the chance to redeem themselves if they returned to the God who never abandoned them. As time passed, Samson's story slowly became something more profound than just the memory of an extraordinary man. It became a collective reflection for the people of Israel, a reminder of their own journey as a nation. Samson, the judge who lived between strength and weakness, between faithfulness and deviation, became a symbol of how the relationship with God was always renewed by mercy, even when the mistakes were great. And while Samson's memory echoed among the Israelites, it also became a story of hope. Despite his failures, Samson showed that God's hand never completely withdrew from his people. Even in the depths of darkness and defeat, there was always light, a chance for reconciliation and restoration. This lesson became vital as Israel faced new challenges and new oppressions. The cycle of infidelity in repentance, of oppression and deliverance, continued. But now, in looking at Samson's story, the people understood something more. The strength that truly mattered was not physical strength but the strength of faith. And that faith, no matter how shaken, could always be restored, just as Samson's hair grew back in the silence of the prison. Samson's story became a pillar of teaching for the generations that followed. It taught that even those who were most distant, most broken, and most lost could still return to God. Samson was living proof that even in the midst of physical and spiritual blindness, the connection with the Lord could be renewed. His final strength was not in his hands but in his repentant heart. The Israelites learned to see in Samson not just a tragic hero, but a reflection of their own collective journey. They learned to value God's mercy, which was always willing to receive them back, no matter how many times they had failed. And thus, Samson, in his death, became a living testimony that redemption is always possible. His legacy transcended the centuries as an eternal lesson: no matter how great the fall, God's power is even greater. Restoration is not just possible, it is certain for those who turn to Him with humility. And so, as Israel moved forward, Samson remained a beacon, a reminder of what it means to be human, and what it means, in the end, to trust completely in God.